Well, welcome. This is the first of a series of online talks from the Queen's College Library in collaboration with the Centre for Manuscript and Textual Cultures. These will look at some of the treasures held by the college and discuss some of the research related to these holdings. Today, I'm pleased to be speaking with Dr. Jennifer Edwards, Career Development Fellow in English at the Queen's College.
Thanks for having me.
Well, and thanks for joining us. And today we're going to be looking at Shakespeare and the Shakespeare folios. But before that, a little bit about you, Jen. You joined Queen's this academic year, and before this you were at Royal Holloway, University of London, and Shakespeare's Globe as a research coordinator. Could you tell us something about your background and research there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Queen's from Shakespeare's Globe in London, where I was research coordinator for 6 years. And that involved performance research in the two theatres that are on site there, providing dramaturgical support for productions as part of a team of kind of advisors for directors and new writers working in those spaces, and leading a series of actor interviews around the productions, particularly in the summer season. So that's kind of a nice blend of page and stage, really, I guess. My background isn't actually performance history. My PhD at Royal Holloway, where I also taught for a few years, looked at ecstatic experiences in Shakespeare and his contemporaries and thought about how out-of-body experiences figure in Renaissance literary, medical, philosophical and religious thinking and writing. So I specialise in Shakespeare and early modern literature, and I'm particularly interested in the histories of emotion and the body.
Great. It's going to be really interesting, I think, thinking about those ideas of embodiment and so on, and indeed the materiality of the text as we get on with this talk. And of course, it's quite strange doing this over Zoom as well, so there's a double level to all of this. So I would like to expand a little bit on what you're currently researching on and your current projects.
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a couple of projects which sort of intersect. The first one is a book that kind of develops that doctoral work on ecstasy and looks at how that experience of being outside or beside yourself, which is what ecstasy etymologically means, how that's described in the Renaissance is kind of spanning a whole emotional scale from the pleasurable to the painful. And then my second project is a little book for the Cambridge Elements series on Shakespeare and performance, which looks at distraction or kinds of attention at Shakespeare's Globe. And that's born out of some of the actor interviews that I mentioned a minute ago that we did each year, but also reviews and show reports, and I guess also critical work on the theatre that kind of repeatedly describes the Globe as this distracted space, but trying to think about that in a more positive as well as a kind of negative way. So those are two kind of big projects that I'm working on right now.
Great. And I suppose as well as carrying on with those, teaching has also continued under lockdown at the college, which has posed some interesting challenges, I suppose, about using texts and original materials in teaching. But have you been able to use the college's collection at all over the last year or since you started?
Yeah, it's been, as you say, a really funny time to join the college and moving in and out of lockdowns. But I was really keen to find ways of using the library collection, particularly for teaching. I know my predecessor, Catherine Hunt, had been able to do that with students in the past. So yes, in Michaelmas term, autumn, my students studying Renaissance literature, 1550 to 1660, spent some time with George Herbert's The Temple, which is just a great text to teach with. It really helps to see how form and content kind of come together in that text in ways that aren't always immediately clear when you're working with modern editions. And then this past term, lockdown kind of thwarted our plan, Matt, really, for you to come and talk to students and be in the library. So you very kindly joined us online for a kind of virtual session where we looked at Margaret Cavendish and the Royal Society and spent a good bit of time looking at versions of Robert Hooke's wonderful flea image in some different publications, which was really fun and actually a really useful way, I think, of kind of starting a term of thinking about natural philosophy and art and nature, etc. And yes, this coming term, I'm really hoping this is the one where we get to be in the library I'll be teaching Shakespeare, so I'm hoping that we can come and look at the first folio, which Beams has. So I'm really, excited to kind of make the most of that.
Yeah, no, we're looking forward to that as well. I mean, it's been interesting exploring how Zoom and using images can help with teaching at this time. But yeah, there's something to be said for actually looking at the original and being in the same room with it and spotting things you may not otherwise have thought about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shall we talk a little bit more about the folio in that case then? And I suppose the question I want to ask first is, why is it such an exciting or important book?
Yeah, it's exciting or significant for lots of reasons, more than I'll be able to cover now. But I suppose one place to start for anyone who doesn't know much about the folio might be the catalogue. So here you've got a kind of complete works, or almost. Maybe we'll come back to that. But so one of the things that the folio makes kind of clear, or what's significant about it, is that it's the first time 18 of these plays printed. That means very simply, without the folio, we wouldn't have texts like Macbeth or The Tempest. They would have been lost, perhaps. We don't have manuscript copies. So in some cases, this is the closest thing that we have to how the plays were written or performed. The second thing is that this is the first time the plays are kind of grouped in this way. So looking at the title page, or the kind of the catalogue, we have these very familiar groupings of comedy, history and tragedy. And it's worth pointing out that these weren't Shakespeare's categories necessarily. By the time the folio was published, 1623, Shakespeare had already been dead for about 7 years. He dies in 1616. So this is actually an editorial decision made by two of Shakespeare's friends or former colleagues, John Hemming and Henry Condell, who compiled the folio for publication. Yeah. So those are two kind of significant things.
Yeah, no, they're really important and interesting to bear in mind. It also brings up another sort of very simplistic question, I suppose. But why is it called a folio anyway?
Yeah, so when we talk about Shakespeare's work in print, you'll get these terms like folio and quarto, which refer to size and I guess kind of status and cost accordingly of these books. So a quarto is a small book where each printed sheet was folded twice into 4 double-sided pages, so 8 leaves. Whereas in the folio, those printed sheets are only folded once into a double-sided, so 4 leaves, which means that it's much bigger. And size matters too. Typically, this kind of format was reserved for high status things like Bibles or history books. So to have plays published in this folio format was a big deal, actually, and it had only been done once before for Ben Jonson's complete works, which we also have in the library, and I really want to come and see. So yeah, publishing it in this way was making quite a big statement about the value of these plays.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how cultural importance and physical size come together here, and certainly where they're kept in the vault, the shelves have been adjusted slightly to mean that they can go on the shelves. Yeah. And I know when taking them off the shelves, you have to be sort of careful of your back. They do weigh a fair bit. Yeah. And I suppose talking there about using the folios and reading them in the library, can you tell us a little bit about the times you've used the first folio in your own research?
Yeah, so I can see behind me on the shelf, I've got a facsimile copy of the folios. You can see how big it is. But in terms of my research, I guess leading on from that point before about the difference between quarto and folio, one kind of line of inquiry with these texts might be looking at the differences between the plays that have been published before in quarto and those that appear, how they appear in the later folio. So at the moment, I'm thinking about trance states, as I said, things like ecstasy, but also epilepsy. And I've been coming back to a moment in Othello where we have a seizure performed on stage, which is actually quite rare on the early modern stage. I'm trying to find other examples. So Othello is one of those plays that appeared in print before in quarto. It's published only a year before in quarto in 1622, so it's just a year between it and the folio. And I find this, so thinking about trance states and epilepsy or ecstasy, there's one moment I find really interesting to look at the differences. There's a speech that's quite expanded in the folio. We get the addition of references to body parts and trembling. And there's a stage direction that's altered from he falls down to he falls in a trance, I think it is. So it does do some work, the folio, in kind of clarifying what's happening. So we might think about the scribe, Ralph Crane, who we think prepared Othello for publication in the folio, as maybe in some way kind of compelled to intensify or diagnose or add clarity to this moment. Yeah, there's lots of examples of differences between plays published in quarto and folio, but that's one that I find quite interesting in thinking about at the moment.
Oh, thank you. Shall we talk a little bit about the first folio held by Queen's College? It has quite an interesting provenance. Is that right?
Yeah. So the folio at Queen's, that Queen's acquired in 1850, was formerly owned by the actor and theatre manager David Garrick, who played a big role in the revival of Shakespeare in the 18th century. And we know that he was a big collector of rare books and assembled his own private library. So it definitely has a kind of additional sense of celebrity, the folio, in that kind of way, the Queen's folio. But that said, other than his book plates, Garrick is actually quite absent from the folio, isn't he? We don't get him furiously scribbling things or cutting things out or changing people's names, which we get in some other folios. There are, I think, some rubbed out scribbles, and I think I read somewhere they kind of hint or hope that they might have been Garrick's, but maybe we'll stay out of that debate today. But that's not to say that the folio, I should say, it's not that it doesn't have any traces of its readers over the last 4 centuries. So it has one of only a few corrected proof sheets. I think this is the 6th one, I think Emma Smith says this, the 6th one that we know of, and it's a page from King Lear. And these were sheets that were taken off the printing press and marked up by hand with errors that needed to be corrected. I think the Queen's one has 9 with errors like missing spaces or missing letters or turned letters. So an N that's put into the press upside down and comes out looking like a U. And errors were really common and printing was really difficult. So this happens all the time. But I guess what we get on this page of the folio is kind of a moment where it reveals part of that process of production. We get a kind of glimpse into the print shop, and I guess we kind of see its first reader too in that way.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, really, that we are looking at something which is incredibly valuable and is an object which is almost venerated, and as an object it seems a thing of beauty, but it's really the mistakes we're often looking out for as scholars and critics, I imagine. And then there's also the story, and which could well be true, about the Queen's College copy, which it has holes, marks in it that perhaps come from tobacco, from people you can imagine smoking whilst reading it. So you also get the sense of the person or people using it in the past. This might sort of track back to your earlier points about your research, I suppose, as well. And it's that question about the item itself, the genuine original item, and how that is useful for scholars, and how it is useful to have signs of reading and use, and what that does for you as a scholar.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when it comes to sales and auctions, like with lots of rare books or antiques even, being pristine, can really increase value. But for scholarship in particular, just even for general interest, I think markings and annotations can really add significance and a different kind of value to these rare books and texts. So yeah, the Queen's folio has a few, but I saw a nice example on Twitter of one of the folios in Birmingham has a paw print on it. But in terms of scholarship, I guess the best recent example of these kind of the value of these signs of readings and usage is a discovery in 2019 by 2 academics, Jason Scott Warren and Claire Bourne, whose work came together in this kind of genuinely collaborative way to identify that a folio in Philadelphia had belonged to John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, who we know was influenced by Shakespeare. And in that copy, we see him engaging with and amending and annotating the text. So there's some really interesting work to come out of that. So yeah, it's really easy to see why a nice, tidy copy might be thought of as valuable and sought after, but it's actually much more interesting, I think, to see how these past readers have been kind of engaging with these texts too.
Yeah, and I suppose the other interesting thing, and thinking about the Queen's College collection as a whole, is the way these volumes, these texts, sit with other texts. And I suppose the most exciting thing, or one of the things the college is perhaps proudest about, is the fact that there are three other editions of the first folio which sit next to the first folio on the shelf. One was owned by and donated to the college by Thomas Barlow, and is perhaps rarer than the first folio. How important is it to have these different editions and the sort of other texts that were circulating at the same time available in one place?
Yeah, there's still, I think, a fair amount of work to be done on, looking at these texts kind of side by side and thinking about the relationships between them. I guess one of the kind of interesting things about the fact that we have this sequence is that we start seeing this the kind of beginnings of editing and modernizing Shakespeare. So they tell us about a kind of desire to bring Shakespeare up to date. I think the second folio makes is it 1,700 adjustments to update the language, and both the second and the third folio they're telling us they're corrected versions of the first one, which tells us there's these kinds of errors, but obviously the second and third bring in their own errors in trying to correct the original ones. So I think it tells us something about, that kind of desire to bring Shakespeare up to date and modernize him, which we're still doing now. I'll still, buy the latest edition of Shakespeare as it comes out. But also there's a kind of market for Shakespeare at the time. We know, for example, that Samuel Pepys, I think, trades in his second folio for a more up-to-date version. So I think there is something to be said of having these kinds of these different iterations of the same text and thinking about the relationship between them. But as I say, I think that's there's still something to be done thinking about the kind of the chronology and the kind of relationship between all four.
Yeah, and then perhaps this is something we can return to in the future. And I'm certainly looking forward to being able to bring these texts out for students to see them and work on them, and indeed scholars more widely. And in fact, even under lockdown, we've been able to carry on scholarly research on them as part of the Shakespeare survey in Pennsylvania. We've been able to add these folios to that survey, and actually have uncovered some changes we needed to make to the cataloguing of one or two of them, so we can add to the bibliographic record in that way. But this has been a fascinating to be able to reflect on these things, even over Zoom at this time, and maybe we'll be able to come back and talk a bit more about some of these texts and the way they are being used today in teaching and research.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, thanks so much for speaking, and thanks again.